And that's a place where two different habitats meet. And it's often a place where there's a great diversity of life and a place of growth and intersection. And as I was thinking about Ched's work, that concept of ecotone came to mind because Ched is someone who works at the place of intersections. The intersection of word and world is at the center of the Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries that Ched founded. Ched also works at the intersection of the academy and the church, of the street and the seminary. And I have seen the way that that work at the intersections has provided some really fruitful reflections that are helpful both for academics who are interested in studying the work of the New Testament, particularly the Gospel of Mark. Many of us are indebted to Ched's work on Mark, especially this lectionary year B. I've been reading a lot of Ched lately. Um, but also in Ched's challenging us to take that work of discipleship into the streets to see clearly as Bartimaeus asked Jesus to help him to do. Ched is the author of many books, Binding the Strong Man, but also is one of his best known, Who Will Roll Away the Stone. But also Ched has helped to bring some important collaborations together that help us name both our situation and what we are called to do. I think particularly of Watershed Discipleship, which is both a book and a concept that I have found so helpful. Ched is also an elder and a mentor. I had the opportunity to go several years ago to the Bartimaeus Institute, and I was interested to watch as many young people came to Ched for conversation, for guidance, and Ched has provided that guidance for me in many ways over the years as well. So thank you, Ched, for being here, and we look forward to your challenge and your wisdom.
Maybe it's good that Elaine's not here. We would have been here all morning in that introduction. You got to work on your alliteration, though. Seminary, at the intersection of seminary, sanctuary, streets, and soil. Get that? Um, can you give us an ecotone? A hum, an ecotone? Just give me a note. Any note. It's got to be an ecotone. Yeah. Were you hearing some of that in the insectiary this morning? With milkweed Keysmont over there? Okay, it's a little early for the jokes. I get it. Can everybody hear okay? Yeah. I want to begin by acknowledging that Elaine does send her regrets, as noted yesterday. This grand uncle, very interesting story for Jake Enns. His family, he was born in Russia in 1920, and the Mennonite community, as some of you may know, was really hammered first by the Russian Revolution and then by the struggle over Ukraine, where Russian forces invaded Ukraine. How contemporary does that sound? On the heels of a global pandemic in 1919. So here we are 100 years later, reliving that history. I'm sorry you missed the chance to meet Elaine and experience her leading of somatic prayer informed by ancient traditions and modern movements like Capacitar and Taizé. which draw on the power of both song and body movement, which we know now act to raise cortisol levels, to regulate emotions, and animate spiritual resilience. So the funeral was on Wednesday, and apparently every living member of her clan were there. And so it was very, very important and beautiful that she could be there with all these elders. So Jake ends presente. Uh, I wanted to remind you to write a note to Ted. That's down on the floor now with an extra page. I really would like as many of you as possible to write a love note to that brother. I've set up another sheet for Michael Iafredi, and maybe somebody can set up one for Brian as well. Would that be a nice thing for folks to write Brian a note? So just have at it. And I want to thank poet Brian and storyteller Sylvia and artist Patty and theologians Hannah and Jonathan for their input and prompting so far. And thank you all for coming all the way to California. Imagine you've figured out that that plane runs in both directions. Here to the Rio Hondo watershed and to come for these conversations and wrestlings. A couple of resource notes. I want to give a shout out to a couple of colleagues, but I don't see, is Sue here? Sue Parker is not here yet. She was here all day yesterday. I believe she's coming back today. That's so short-sighted. Well, maybe she'll rejoin us tomorrow. She's one of our dear friends and colleagues. She's the National Anti-Racist Coordinator for the Mennonite Church in the U.S. and co-founder of the spectacular work of Reconciliation, which is organizing and educating around restorative justice in and beyond the Korean community, both in LA and on the Korean Peninsula. She's a Mennonite pastor, a beautiful spirit, fierce advocate. So check her out if she comes back tomorrow. I was really glad she joined us yesterday. And y'all, most of you know veteran EPer Mark Laubranson. Mark, just raise your hand back there. One of the elders of this movement now, decorated career as a practical theologian at Fuller Seminary. In retirement, however, he's become a solar panel production entrepreneur, a curator in a venture called CHERP, CHERP, that prioritizes jobs for low-income people. It's both a local movement and a national movement, right? It's really exciting as an intersectional venture. And I invite those of you who will be here for lunch to circle up at a table. Mark will host a table and listen about this amazing project. Mark and Sue are local folks. They both live in Pasadena, and we all us SoCals kind of feel like co-hosts to this gathering. So be sure and get to know them. And for what it's worth, I've set up a little table over here in the what do we call this? Oh, the South Transept, with some of our propaganda from Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries, if you're interested. We confessed at the beginning of our little reflection notes that all of us in doing this work this weekend are just the proverbial visually impaired persons trying to describe the elephant, each of us only seeing part of the picture. It really struck us that this ancient wisdom story from Asia is particularly appropriate to our theme, since climate crisis is the elephant in our civilizational room. So I'm going to try to just summarize a few thoughts. I've been thinking back to my only previous time with the Ecclesia Project in Chicago. Exactly 10 years ago this week, we talked about climate crisis as the greatest challenge to our faith and discipleship. And a number of you have mentioned that you remember that gathering, which is really sweet. A decade later, things are far less eschatological, that is something to reckon with in the future, and far more existential. And here we are again, feeling its heat in California with 3 major wildfires burning in the state as we speak. So that's a lot of body memory for me as a survivor of the Thomas Fire in 2017. So we offered a dialectical reflection in our paper between the related but distinct practices of grieving and remorse, oftentimes conflated, actually quite different. We affirm grief work as necessary for our inward journey of climate discipleship, but not in itself sufficient. It must be accompanied by an outward journey, which we propose as one of remorse and recovery as defined by the addiction community. So this is the point at which Elaine would ask us to stand and sing together. She'd offer a call and response. She would offer us to stand and sing together. She'd offer a call and response song about the dialectic of this work, and it would go like this. I'll sing it, you sing it back to me. Deep down inside of me, deep down inside of me, I got a fire going on. I've got a fire going on. Once again, but pick it up sooner. Deep down inside of me, I've got a fire going on. Part of me wants to sing about the light, and part of me wants to cry, cry, cry. Deep down inside of me, I got a fire going on. Deep down inside of me, I've got a fire going on. Part of me wants to sing about the light, and part of me wants to cry, cry, cry. Deep down inside of me. Thank you. That's a chant of grief and remorse we learned from friends in the Detroit Song Circle, particularly appropriate today for all the reasons we're talking about and the fact that this is the 8th anniversary of the mass shooting that took place in Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida, killing 49, wounding 50 others, and reminding us of another one of our profound addictions. On the cry, cry, cry side, our paper looked at two expressions of grieving that we think are problematic. One are the claims, oftentimes in relatively privileged circles, of disenfranchised grief. This is a notion that's circulating in climate psychology. And then we also talked about the problem of abstract grief and all the overwhelming data and factoids and trying to keep up with that and absorb all of that. Then we tried to explore two approaches we think are more helpful, one working with the hospice paradigm and the other with relational lament. And so I just want to say a word about relational lament. We really appreciated Hannah's focus on christening as a relational practice and think that correlates well with the emphasis we've worked with over the last 15 years of watershed discipleship. We commend how Senegalese environmentalist Baba Dioum, you probably know this trope, he stated in a 1968 speech to the United Nations, he offered this simple syllogism: we won't save places we don't love. It is not possible to love places we don't actually know. But ignorance and alienation are socialized conditions, he asserted, and so we don't know places because we haven't learned them. Including their names. So I think this captures the deepest roots of our civilizational crisis. We're ruining the planet because we haven't apprenticed to it. And we live as if our lives didn't depend on them, which they do. Uh, so let's try another little phonic exercise of voicing and naming here as a community. Raise your hand if you know the name of the watershed which you currently inhabit. Just raise your hand. So I want 3 or 4 of you just to stand and volunteer to name your watershed out loud and proud. Raccoon River. Oh, one more. Beautiful. Now raise your hand if you know the name of one endangered species in the place that you dwell in. Okay, so maybe 3 or 4 of you just stand and name that endangered species. Thank you. One more. And finally, who of you can name one recent public action of lament or resistance around climate crisis that has recently taken place in your home place, whether or not you yourself were part of that? Do you people want to name actions? Let's go. Well, thank you. Here we are being church in the matter suggested by Hannah, replacing the geography in prayer and of prayer. On that last issue, the geography of prayer, right? That has to do with public action. So I wanted to share a couple of resources in the paper. We talked about Stephen Charleston's book. I'll say more about that in a minute. But Laurel Dykstra's new book, Wildlife Congregations, is about the kind of apprenticeship of learning names. She took a year as an Anglican priest in British Columbia and just went out into the watershed and learned, observed, and learned about all kinds of winged ones and finned ones and crawling ones. And she writes about it as having church out. And it's just a beautiful book, just came out, and I want to commend it to you. It's a local publisher, but you can find it. It's called Wildlife Congregations, Laurel Dykstra. I also wish to underline, Hannah, you were talking about this yesterday, the notion of prayer as action, or praying with our feet, as some traditions call it. And those of you who are under 45, I want to commend dear friend and colleague Bill Wiley Kellerman's classic book, Seasons of Faith and Conscience, still in print, thanks to Whitfenstock. Seasons of Faith and Conscience. It was written a generation ago about practices of liturgical direct action. And this is a tradition that's been around now for 2 generations, and it's important to learn from it. And as noted, we really trust the wise voice of Choctaw elder and Episcopal Bishop Stephen Charleston. His new book, We Survived the End of the World, Lessons from Native America on Apocalypse and Hope. It's a broadleaf book. It really reorients us about thinking how to navigate climate catastrophe through the spirit of survivance found among indigenous communities on Turtle Island under the Holocaust of settler colonialism. So I really wish that everybody in this gathering would get a hold of that as part of your ongoing reflection on the theme of this conference. This is a very, very important book. It's called We Survived the End of the World, Lessons from Native America on Apocalypse and Hope. It's cited in our paper. The second half of our paper looks at what we consider the more helpful discourse of remorse. Grief tends to be the response to trauma in which we've had no agency or particular responsibility, something we feel done to us. Remorse is about, it's defined as intense and painful self-condemnation and penitence due to a consciousness of responsibility. From the medieval Latin, I love this, remorsum, a biting back. And that's what it feels like when you feel genuine remorse. It feels like what happened is biting us back. And that's right. That's where we are in our historical moment. Obviously, we have to free that framework from shame culture that's been a part of pietism in particular. But I think this can help us rehabilitate the biblical discourse of repentance as turning personal and political history around. We really believe that this semantic complex is a crucial corrective to what we might call privileged grieving. That is, grieving that really carries no imperative to change, especially because corporations are actively fighting to continue their pillaging as they compete fiercely for the extractive spoils of a world on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Here we agree with Jonathan. Grief, again, usually implies personal loss, and it's easy to imagine ourselves as victims of climate forces beyond our control. But let's be very clear, as Jonathan is, this apocalypse is not being inflicted on us. It's being inflicted by us. And therein lies the huge watershed. It is a direct and indirect result of human systems. Human impacts have had a long history, but over the last half millennium have become acute through the continuing imposition of settler colonialism and extractive capitalism, which have wrought social and ecological displacement, destruction, and disparity in every corner of this blue earth. We probably need to have more clarifying conversation with Jonathan on the matter of human beings as such being equally implicated. We argue that neither the poor or traditional societies through the ages have very specifically not engineered regimes of androcentric presumption and stupid consumption. But we can return to that point. It's a complicated one, as he mentioned. So we propose the addiction recovery model as the best approximation for a climate discipleship of remorse. And, we all have to honor St. Wendell Berry in his famous quote, "The great obstacle is simply this, the conviction that we cannot change because we are dependent upon what is wrong. But that is the addict's excuse, and it will not do." So we live in acute denial of the consequences of our bad behavior, and we feel powerless to change because of a socialized conviction, what we live by, that we can't do anything about it. We think the addiction diagnosis is appropriate because it's ultimately addressing a terminal disease. And the singular and unequivocal prescription of recovery, right? Recover or die, represents the most appropriate contemporary personal and political paradigm for how to engage climate catastrophe, particularly for a nation and social class like our own. Our system has driven and profited from carbon capitalism while also managing to ensure that the first and worst consequences are being inflicted upon poor communities of color at home and abroad. This addiction will not be transformed by grieving rituals alone. It requires a radical remorse that embraces a life journey of political and personal repentance and recovery. And we talk about the 12 steps, and we talk about our model of Sabbath economics, household practices. So we poke around the concepts of remorse as recovery, as solidarity, as restorative justice, and as decolonization. This last vector being symbolized in the standoff at Standing Rock in 2017, where indigenous nations faced down the carbon pharaohs in perhaps the most extraordinary expressions of prayer and presence as resistance in our entire history in the US. Finally, we appealed to the tradition of weeping prophets as biblical expressions of the dialectic, both the spirituality of lament and the politics of remorse and accountability. We close our paper by invoking the epistle to the Ephesians, and I also want to end with that, the great ecumenical encyclical that circulated in the late first century, because it echoes the deep prophetic tradition and resonates sharply with our own moment. Ephesians 5 exhorts the church to remain awake and sober in order to expose darkness and proceed wisely to make the most of the times. Ephesians 6, in turn, urges us to put on the full armor of God, necessary to boldly proclaim the mystery of the gospel, for which the Apostle Paul became an ambassador in chains. 2 millennia later, we're fighting for creation and for ourselves against formidable powers who continue exploiting the crisis they have engineered. And evangelists for climate recovery and resistors to carbon addiction are again landing in jail, friends. Some of them are our associates, such as Catholic workers who participated in nonviolent valve turner shutdowns of oil pipelines, a protest that was for them an expression of indigenous solidarity. So those are some of the gropings we threw into the mix around the elephant. And let's just chant one more time. Deep down inside of me, I got a fire going on. Deep down inside of me, I got a fire going on. Part of me wants to sing about the light, and part of me wants to cry, cry, cry. Deep down inside of me. All right, let's go back to our conversations. Thanks.
All right, so we're going to get started with our questions, and there were a number of questions around this model of recovery, and particularly the ways that that might be enacted in our communities, and what are some of the particulars of recovery that you think are important, especially thinking about 12-step programs. You've got the community, you have the accountability, the truth telling, and the not one drop understanding. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I met Ragan at the EP gathering 10 years ago, and we both think it's been longer, but just so grateful for his work. And have you seen his new book? It just showed up. Where are you going to have this so people can get it? Out,
Table in the back.
out in the front? Okay, be sure and get it. It's called The Art of Being a Creature, Meditations on Humus and Humility. This is what, your fourth or fifth book now? Fourth book. It's great stuff. So Cascade just did it as the faithful publisher of the movement. So be sure and grab a copy. And I think it's worth taking a moment to give a little love to Ragan and Deborah and the EP board for all the work that went into this. Let's show them some love. Is Tina here? Tina Mata? There she is. I neglected to mention her also as a local. She's in LA. Tina Mata has her finger in every pot worth stirring. And she's just a mother of the movement here locally. So be sure and hang out with Tina in the time that we have remaining. Right, this is about community building. EP always has been. So I just want to point out some of the local geniuses, and we're all glad to be with you all. Um, yeah, how many of you would say you're familiar with the 12-step framework? Really, only about half. Um, how many of you have 12-step programs somewhere in your church or your church building? See, look at that. Interesting. Um, this is, uh, it started out of the Oxford Revival movement in the 1930s in the UK. So it was originally Christian, kind of a Christian insurrection against the epidemic of alcoholism in particular. And in the ensuing almost 100 years now, it has become the most popular form of personal transformation, grassroots personal transformation um, that we have. And it often happens in the basement of our churches, and folk don't even know about it, where real discipleship and real transformation is happening because people, it's so gospel in its orientation. People have finally come to terms with the terminal diagnosis of their condition. Um, they used to call that, taking the sinner's bench. Um, but that, unlike too much, particularly evangelical Christianity, the conversion doesn't end with that recognition. It begins with that recognition, and the rest of your life is about covenanting to change everything. And so it's about the twin encounter with um, self and the divine, and with the harms that one has instigated in the community and with one's own body. Um, so, there's a whole um, it's a journey. It's a discipleship journey. The 12 steps is journey language, but it has to do with recognizing not only one's condition but uh, the harms one has caused and making amends and taking moral inventory. I mean, it just simply could not be more gospel, and yet it still is considered marginal on the life of the church. Um, the church, every church ought to be a community in recovery. Um, and I think there's a great deal we can learn from that. So we talk a little bit about in the papers some of the practical measures of the household economy, which we talk about in our Sabbath Economics household economy, and we take that because um, one's household economics is the concrete point of intersection between self and system, right? We all earn money, we all spend money, we all consume, we all generate waste, right? We do all those things. Individual practices won't change systems, but they keep us mindful of the contradictions so that we can engage then also in public witness um, and sort of intermediate institutional transformation like the Chirp Solar um, venture. So, so it's about stopping habits, um, not because you can't continue them, um, but because if you do, you will die. And but it's also about what you add to your life in terms of your engagement with harm and your engagement with reparation and your engagement in a community of accountability. It cannot be done alone. Again, it's a great ecclesial model. So we just think that as a community of climate resistance and discipleship, it is the best model. And um, our concern was that grief ritualizing was not necessarily translating into engagement. With addiction recovery, you can't escape that. You're either working the program or you're not. Do you want to? Yeah. And it's about steps. Um, and we were talking yesterday about, only kind of um, don't doom scroll, only perceive as much as you can actually respond to. And the steps are about taking concrete steps, and think of your own journey. How long did it take you to wean yourself off um, petrol? Yes, that's meant to be a very disturbing question. Um, it's not impossible, but it took us longer than it should have. And these steps are meaningful, um, not because you virtue signal because you've achieved something, but because it allows you to now focus on another step and another step. And these steps are meaningful, even though they themselves, by themselves, will not transform systems. So that's just the household side of it. Um, how it translates into systems is more tricky, and we've in talking both sides of the street, we oftentimes get kicked out of churches for being too political. But there's the same reluctance in 12-step groups. We've had 12-step people say, "Don't politicize our model." Um, well, that's the culture talking, right? We have this ability to privatize everything in order to domesticate it, and so we've also got to help 12-step um, the 12-step movement understand the political implications of its own model. I think. How's that for a rambling answer?
I think that's a helpful answer. And one of the other questions that's come up is how do we think about that collective response, and particularly collective remorse, but also as we do that, who's in the collective, and how do we think about those who are living on the margins, those who are impoverished, who may not have the means to eat 100-mile diet or to think about trash in the same kinds of ways that someone of privilege might. And so how do we do this work of collective grieving, remorse, thinking about all the people in our communities?
Yeah, that's a great observation that the 12-step movement has to be a community organizing movement. Food deserts exist because of social architecture. They didn't fall from the sky. So if folks can't get healthy food, it's not because they signed up for that. It's because market forces and um, redlining and blue lining and all the rest have um, have created that situation. Community organizing can change that. It's changed that. We did a lot of community organizing in Northwest Pasadena here back in the 80s and 90s around getting a healthy supermarket into a neighborhood that only had the proverbial corner liquor store as a place to get food. So that's where uh, the kind of the smug NIMBYism that's all about how all the cool stuff I'm doing in my little bubble. This isn't about that. That's like you wouldn't find that attitude in a 12-step group. It's not about being smug. It's about being um, sober together because we're all drunks. And Kurt Vonnegut, by the way, writes this beautiful letter to the future where he says, dear future, is dated 2006, just before he died. Dear future, we apologize. We were roaring drunk on petroleum. Um, so, it's possible for us to understand the social architecture of disparity in terms of options. Junk food, high sugar food, diabetes creating food, that's all part of a socially engineered plan. And we also have to turn that around. It's not enough just to turn our own household economies around. Neighborhood economies, community economies, that's all part of this. It's seamless as a matter of our discipleship. We don't have the luxury of separating the personal and political anymore. Not that we ever did, but it's just such a deeply ingrained habit in our churches. It's part of the addiction. Um, and so we've got to dismantle that.
There were several questions around this idea of hospice and particularly in response to Jonathan's talk and thinking about our condition as terminal. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about how we practice hospice, and also I'd like to hear. I mean, my understanding is you've moved a little bit on your understanding of hospice. That sometimes that language can be about sort of giving up or might and so can you speak a little bit more to how we can actively engage with this hospice process?
Yeah, thanks for that. How many of you have of yourselves actively participated in a hospice caretaking? Right. So again, about a third of us. Would you agree it's one of the most transforming experiences? It's just in every sense. And the more we communitize hospice, deprivatize hospice, but communitize it into a thing where extended family and community and neighborhoods are involved, the more transformative it is. So I wrote a little bit about our community hospice experiment 22 years ago. That was really the most life transforming thing that I've ever done. When talk of Earth Hospice bubbled up about 10 years ago, at least that's when I became aware of it, I was ambivalent about it because I felt like it was based on a kind of very thin idea of hospice as something you do, as last resort and when you've given up all other hope. That's generally not how hospice should be embraced. It should be embraced as we talk about in the paper, it's a time to deal with last things, but always with two qualifications. One is it's you hold out hope for whatever can happen, and no matter what happens, what you do in caretaking and affection and relationality and discussion of last things is meaningful, even if the diagnosis doesn't change. And and so I think the more we understand hospice as really life-giving, not death douling. I don't mean to disparage death douling. I think that's a really important thing that's happening. But again, in the culture, it's sort of seen as this giving up kind of thing. And that won't sustain one in the hard work of hospice. We have to see it as a life-giving thing. So, yeah, I think it's an important paradigm, right? We were just throwing out different ideas, and I think that's an important one to explore, but with preferably with a non-caricatured idea of hospice, if that makes any sense. This is about living with the dying in a compassionate and relational and really symbiotic way. What would that mean to do that in our watersheds, to accompany endangered species? That when you frame it like that, are you going to fight for an endangered species if you just say, that species is going to be gone anyway? Probably not. But if you see it as, we don't know whether we might turn this around, but even if we don't, it's worth accompanying this species in whatever way we can. That's part of ministry. That's part of diaconia with creation. So I think it's we're casting around for models here, and I think that's one worth considering.
I know that we're going to talk about time in a moment, but I know we're coming up on it. So one thing that I want to end with is it's so easy in these kinds of conversations, even thinking about hospice, because we're trained into it, to think about effectiveness and that mindset of effectiveness, and that can sometimes drive us towards the grand geoengineering projects and whatnot. And so how do we as disciples think about this challenge of moving out of that effectiveness paradigm? And even if you have some helpful passages of scripture that you might point us to in answering that challenge, we'd appreciate that.
Um, we agree with Jonathan's premise that we are facing a terminal situation. Um, the question, but that begs the question. So then what? And hospice or any diagnosis of um, termination represents an apocalyptic event. It's going to reveal who people really are, both the individual or the community that is under threat and those who are accompanying them. And um, in the culture, and Jonathan was pointing this out, the culture panics and attempts to, do Houdini pulling rabbits out of hats, um, or kind of the heroic super engineering. We can fix this, which of course is just reproducing more of the same. Um, this this is an apocalyptic moment in the truest sense, an unveiling of who we really are, and so it's a call to discipleship in the truest sense, and I think it's a moment that um, can um, can animate the conversion of the church, the renewal of the church. Um, and if it doesn't, then the church ought to die along with the dying, um, because it's not offering life. Um, so um, it's if you've ever had the experience of breaking the news to somebody, um, it really challenges you to your core as to what are your words and what are your actions now in light of this. And that kind of honest unveiling is important for this moment, but it's greater than that. And I want to plug this again. We kind of concluded with this, but um, Stephen Charleston reminds us that the ultimatum that we have imposed on ourselves has a history, and it is in fact not new. We have genocided whole communities and cultures in our history, and so what does it mean to listen to communities who have um, survived that, um, as opposed to having this unique sense of we're special and this is terrible because it's happening to us. Um, and one of the tropes of whiteness is to universalize our experience. So it's real easy for us to say, so this is happening to all of humanity because it's happening to us. Um, and rather taking a more humble humus perspective that says, what can we learn from folks who actually have been on the business side of this for a very long time and have found ways to survive and to witness, um, and even to heal, regardless of what the ultimate outcome is. I just there is so much gospel in the theme of this conference, um, that the church, our churches have to try not to be church in this moment. It's just, this is dripping with the invitation to come be the people of the way. Um, so it's my hope that we will not collapse to the conventional wisdom, right? So beautifully captured in the film Don't Look Up. Let's not talk about this. Let's not talk about this. It's too controversial. That is the way of denial and death in our churches. But to talk about it, you're going to have a lot of people walk out of church, and you're going to have a lot more people walk into church. because we are, in fact, becoming a community of recovery.
Well, Ched, one group commented that our process hasn't allowed for enough appreciation of the words that have been offered, but they wanted to make sure that you knew how much they appreciated your words, and I think we all do, and so let's show our appreciation to Ched. So I think we have a few announcements, and of course we are not on schedule, as you can tell, but we built a good amount of margin into our afternoon, and so we're just going to kind of push things on so that we allow plenty of time for Patty's presentation and our project and our hike and all. So we've got a good like 2.5 hours in the afternoon, so we can kind of push into that a little bit and adjust our schedule accordingly. So I think if we'll just take a short break and reconvene here at 11:20. Does that work for folks? 10 minute break? Does that and then we'll reconvene with Patty's presentation. So I think we have a couple of announcements about lunch and logistics with that.
Hi, everyone. Just a couple of announcements. The first one is the bathrooms can lock on their own without anyone in them. So if you notice that you're knocking and no one is answering and it's locked, come see me. I have a master key. I can unlock them. So I just unlocked 2. If you are still interested in going on the hike this afternoon, the sign-up sheet is still in the back. It is not too late to sign up, so please put your name on that list. Related to that are the need for orders for sack lunches. And back there are some blank lunch bags, and then there are sample of what we need, what information we need on it. Like the type of bread and the type of protein you want on your sandwich. So if you have not filled out one of these, please do so Amy and I can make your lunches. And we will do it as best according to the supplies that we have. So I think that's all that I have. Yes. Well, what time will we gather to leave for the hike? I think we'll presentation. So that would put it at noon.
Tonight, there is going to be a film discussion of the film All That Breathes, which if you would like to participate in it, you're meant to have watched the film already, or else there won't be much to discuss. But if you have watched the film and would like to talk about it with some other people, I will be hosting that tonight. And we're going to go out and get food at the street fair and then meet in the library park. So if you would like to do that, go ahead and meet me in the foyer in the front after the foot washing service, and we'll walk over together to be able to find a meeting spot for that.
I uploaded some materials from Mona yesterday. She had a slide deck that we weren't able to show, so that is there. Also, she posted a sample land acknowledgement. So if that's something that you want more information about, so that's in the Google Drive folder. Just a reminder that if you need, in a kind of pastoral way, to process or be prayed with around these matters that Phil and Sharon are going to be available 3:30 to 4:30, but I guess now that's 3:45 to 4:45. So that hour slot, which is in the break time, and they're going to sort of be over here. So feel free to avail yourselves of their pastoral wisdom. And tonight, after dinner, for those who want to come back and participate in a grief circle, we're gonna do that, and that's for a couple of reasons. For us to bring our own personal and collective grief around whatever that is, we will kind of do that in a guided conversation way. But also, if you're interested in what a grief circle is, what it looks like, how you might incorporate that into your community, then you will participate in one. So in the email, in the body of the email that Gary sent out a few times that's got the link to the Google Drive, there's a little blurb about the grief circle. It's not in the folder, but it's in the body of the email. I think that's all I have, okay? So, Patty, so break. I think we're gonna have to move it, I mean, 10 minutes, 11:25. We'll be back and give Patty her full time.